The forms which have had special meaning for me since childhood have been the standing form, which is the translation of my feeling towards the human being standing in landscape. The two forms, which is the tender relationship of one living thing beside another. And the closed form, such as the oval, spherical, or pierced form, sometimes incorporating colour, which translates for me the association and meaning of gesture in landscape. In the repose of, say, a mother and child, or the feeling of the embrace of living things, either in nature or in the human spirit.
The artist Barbara Hepworth was born in Wakefield, Yorkshire, in 1903. She died in St Ives, Cornwall, in 1975. The words in this film, newly recorded, are drawn from her writings, from interviews, and from her letters.
All my early memories are of forms and shapes and textures, moving through and over the West Riding landscape with my father in his car. The hills were sculptures. The roads defined the form. Above all, there was the sensation of moving physically over the contours of the fullnesses and concavities, through hollows and over peaks, feeling, touching, seeing, through mind and hand and eye. This sensation has never left me. I, the sculptor, am the landscape. I am the form, and I am the hollow, the thrust, and the contour. Perhaps what one wants to say is formed in childhood, and the rest of one's life is spent in trying to say it. I know that all I felt during the early years of my life in Yorkshire is dynamic and constant in my life today. I was the firstborn. We were poor as my parents were young, and my father was working his way up from the bottom to the top of his profession. My mother was beautiful and gay, and it was she who saved and scraped to inspire me to further effort in music and dance and book scholarship. Wakefield Cathedral, where I was confirmed, played a large part in my early life, and the Wakefield Girls' High School also. My headmistress of that time remained my friend for many years. At the age of 7, her lecture and slides of Egyptian sculpture fired me off. When I arrived at the Royal College of Art, they said I was too young and set me to do a test, and I was allowed to stay. Then student days and trips to Paris, an expanding world. I was married to John Skeeping in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, and then lived in the British school in Rome, where we continued our explorations. After 2 years, John was not well, and it was necessary to return home. This was a wonderfully happy time. My son Paul was born, and with him in his cot, or on a rug at my feet, my carving developed and strengthened. Generalization, by which I mean an accumulative assertion of the emotion of the thing, is nearer to the abstract than particularization, which is a faithful portrayal of an individual object. My trend is towards generalization, but I have not dispensed with representation entirely. I did not see what was happening to us after our second show together. Quite suddenly, we were out of orbit. I had an obsession for my work, and my child and my home. There was no ill feeling. We fell apart. Friends and relations always said to me that it was impossible to be dedicated to any art and enjoy marriage and children. This is untrue, as I had nearly 30 years of wonderful family life. But I will confess that the dictates of work are as compelling for a woman as for a man, not competitively, but as complementary. This was a period of real maturity. I met Ben Nicholson, and as painter and sculptor, each was the other's best critic. We visited Haysborough and gathered stones to carve, and drew and painted. In the pierced form, I felt the most intense pleasure in piercing the stone in order to make an abstract form and space. Quite a different sensation from that of doing it for the purpose of realism. In trying to find a new way of composing forms, other than by the accepted order of human anatomy, or by my own experience of the special forms induced by carving direct into the material, and feeling in harmony with the properties of wood or stone, I discovered a new approach, which would allow me to build my own sculptural anatomy, dictated only by my poetic demands from the material. The predisposition to carve is not enough. There must be a positive living and moving towards an ideal. In the contemplation of nature, we are perpetually renewed. Our sense of mystery and our imagination is kept alive, and rightly understood, it gives us the power to project into a plastic medium some universal or abstract vision of beauty. I think the very nature of art is affirmative, and in being so, it reflects the laws and the evolution of the universe. In our present time, so governed by fear of destruction, the artist senses more and more the energies and impulses which give life and are the affirmation of life. Perhaps by learning more and letting the microcosm reflect the macrocosm, a new way of life can be found, which will allow the human spirit to develop and surmount fear. Yes, my article is very solemn and serious. Carving is, you know, compared with painting. There is an inside and an outside to every form. When they are in special accord, as for instance, a nut in its shell or a child in the womb, or in the structure of shells or crystals, or when one senses the architecture of bones in the human figure, then I am most drawn to the effect of light. Every shadow, cast by the sun from an ever-varying angle, reveals the harmony of the inside and outside. Ben had complained a little bit that I seemed withdrawn and concentrated over my pregnancy, but suddenly I said, "Oh dear," and in next to no time I saw 3 small children at the foot of my bed, looking pretty determined and fairly belligerent. When I started carving again in November 1934, my work seemed to have changed direction, although the only fresh influence had been the arrival of the children. The work was more formal, and all traces of naturalism had disappeared, and for some years I was absorbed in the relationships in space, in size and texture, and weight, as well as in the tensions between the forms. It must be so essentially sculpture that it can exist in no other way, something still and yet having movement, so very quiet and yet with a real vitality. Gropius, Moholy-Nagy, Breuer, Mendelssohn had all come to live in London, and suddenly England seemed alive and rich, the centre of an international movement in architecture and art. We all seemed to be carried on the crest of this robust and inspiring wave of imaginative and creative energy. We were not at that time prepared to admit that it was a movement in flight, but because of the danger of totalitarianism and impending war, all of us worked harder to lay strong foundations for the future through an understanding of the true relationship between architecture, painting, and sculpture. Carving became increasingly rhythmical, and I was aware of the special pleasure that sculptors can have through carving, that of a complete unity of physical and mental rhythm. It seemed to be the most natural occupation in the world. It is perhaps strange that I should have become aware of this at the moment when the forms themselves had become the absolute reverse of all that was arbitrary, when there had developed a deliberate conception of form and relationship. At the most difficult moment of this period, I did the maquette for the first sculpture with colour, and when I took the children to Cornwall 5 days before war was declared, I took the maquette with me. Ben knew St. Ives, but I felt opposed to coming to a place I had never seen. Arriving in August at midnight, with very weary children in pouring rain, my spirits were at zero. Next morning, I appreciated the beauty and sense of community and realized that it would be possible to find some manual work and raise the children and take part in community life, which has nourished me ever since. We set about finding ways of working and helping the war effort. During the mid-40s, I did some of my best work. I had only limited space, a backyard, a room only 8 feet high, and endless complaints about my hammering. What I did not perceive at this time, either because I was too tired, or too stupid, or both, was that the house was cracking up, and the family bursting at the seams. There's an oval sculpture of 1943. I was in despair because my youngest daughter, one of the triplets, had osteomyelitis. She was ill for 4 years. I thought the only thing I can do to help this awful situation, because we never knew if it would worsen, was to make some beautiful object, something so clear as I can make it, as a kind of present for her. 3 children of the same age want everything at the same time, but individually. This was a problem for them as well as for Ben and me. It is a good thing, perhaps, that one does not foresee tragedy ahead. In 1951, after 20 years of family life, everything was to fall apart. Finding Trewin's studio was a sort of magic. For 10 years I had passed by with my shopping bags, not knowing what lay behind the 20-foot walls. It was my friend Marcus Brumwell who persuaded me to go to the auction and bid for the place when it came up for sale. Here was a studio, a yard and a garden, where I could work in open air and space. My left hand is my thinking hand. The right is only a motor hand. This holds the hammer. The left hand, the thinking hand, must be relaxed, sensitive. The rhythms of thought pass through the fingers and grip of this hand into the stone. It is also a listening hand. It listens for basic weaknesses of flaws in the stone, for the possibility or imminence of fractures. It was during this time that I gradually discovered the remarkable pagan landscape which lies between St. Ives, Penzance and Land's End. A landscape which still has a very deep effect on me, developing all my ideas about the relationship of the human figure in landscape, sculpture in landscape, and the essential quality of light in relation to sculpture, which induced a new way of piercing the forms to contain colour. Sculpture is a three-dimensional projection of primitive feeling, touch, texture, size and scale, hardness and warmth, evocation and compulsion to move, live and love. Landscape is strong. It has bones and flesh and skin and hair. It has age and history and a principle behind its evolution. and strings in many of the carvings of this time. The colour in the concavities plunged me into the depth of water, caves, or shadows deeper than the carved concavities themselves. The strings were the tension I felt between myself and the sea, the wind or the hills. One of my sculptures is called Pelagos, meaning the sea. Well, from my studio I could see the whole bay of St. Ives, and my response to this view was that of a primitive who observes the curves of coast and horizon and experiences, as he faces the ocean, a sense of containment and security rather than the dangers of an endless expanse of waters. So Pelagos represents not so much what I saw as what I felt. These are all sea forms and rock forms related to Porthcurno on the Land's End coast with its queer caves pierced by the sea. They were experiences of people. The movement of people in and out is always a part of them. They are bronze sculptures, and the material allows more openness, of course. I was a comparative newcomer to bronze, so I used it extravagantly to see how far I could go. It has a presence, but it doesn't look at you in the way that a carving does. There is a stronger sense of participating in the form. I prefer my works to be shown outside. I think sculpture grows in the open light, and with the movement of the sun, its aspect is always changing, and with space and the sky above, it can expand and breathe. The artist needs not only a landscape, but also a society. He needs not only a spectator, but also a response from society. All the artist can seek to do is to acknowledge his need of society and his debt to it within himself, to allow his compassion to grow, and at the same time fulfill his obligations as a human being, and then have complete faith in the unconscious but logical evolution within himself of new forms which will hold the content of his imagination. I like variety of scale and imagination and material, and I like strong juxtapositions, something dynamic and not discreet and ladylike. It is often stated that women's work is best when it accepts the limitations of their sex and is most feminine. But by being feminine, it has never scaled the upper reaches of achievement in art, and presumably never will. This belief in the inevitable inferiority of women's art presupposes a competitive element between the sexes. I do not believe that women are in competition with men. I believe that they have a sensibility, a perception, and a contribution to make which is complementary to the masculine, and which completes the total experience of life. If this is accepted, instead of feeling cheated because a woman is not a man, it becomes possible to enrich one's experience by the contemplation of a bivalent expression of idea. From the moment I entered the operating theatre, I became completely absorbed by two things. First, the extraordinary beauty of purpose and coordination between human beings, all dedicated to the saving of life, and the way that unity of idea and purpose dictated a perfection of concentration, movement, and gesture. And secondly, by the way this special grace of mind and body, induced a spontaneous space composition. I happened to look up into the great lamp above, and in the dark hemisphere projecting in the centre was reflected the whole scene, wonderfully distorted in perspective, and unrecognizable in a realistic sense, and yet giving the whole unity and purpose in a completely poetic way. The periphery of heads with arms and hands radiating far away in great depth, which was the wound, so that when I looked back at the group in front of me, one felt all the more keenly the terrific sculptural idea in all the figures in the cubic space of the theatre, and I felt inside each of them. We are much preoccupied, all of us, in thoroughly working out the status of artist to society, and that will never be solved by a commission of fine arts, but only by the artist being allowed to take his place along with other workers. We cast it in aluminium because of its comparative lightness. After all, it's a bird-like form about to take off. The only thing that put me out was the lamp post, which was erected in front as soon as I'd got the sculpture up. But I was very grateful again for the opportunity of working on a big scale. Before Dag Hammarskjöld's death, we had discussed together the kind of form he had envisaged to go in front of the Secretariat. When I heard of his death, and in order to assuage my grief, I immediately made a large new version of single form, just for myself. Later, when the Secretary-General heard of this, he asked me if I would go to New York and discuss the project as Dag Hammarskjöld had envisaged it. Throughout my work on the single form, I have kept in mind Dag Hammarskjöld's ideas of human and aesthetic ideology, and I have tried to perfect a symbol that would reflect the nobility of his life, and at the same time give us a motive and symbol of both continuity and solidarity for the future. It is important for an artist never to talk out his ideas until he has made them concrete as works of art. In explaining what one intends to do, one always wastes or loses some of the energy that is required to achieve the work of art. Sculpture to me is primitive, religious, passionate, and magical. Always, always affirmative. Still, there is an element of intellectualism in my sculpture too. I feel that sculpture is always, to some extent, an intellectual game, though the sculptor generally obeys sensuous impulses. The sculptor sets out to appeal to all the senses of the spectator, in fact, to his whole body, not merely to his sight and his sense of touch. I went out to Venice in June 1950. Every day I sat for a time in the Piazza San Marco, and as soon as people or groups of people entered the piazza, they responded to the proportions of the architectural space. They walked differently, discovering their innate dignity. They grouped themselves in unconscious recognition of their importance in relation to each other as human beings. I noticed in Venice generally that there were particular movements of happiness springing from a mood among people which seemed to imbue them at once with greater swiftness and a certainty of movement and gesture, and at the same time a greater relaxation. I became more and more preoccupied with the inside and outside of forms, as I had been in the late 1930s, but on a bigger scale. I wanted to make forms to stand on hillsides, and through which to look to the sea. Forms to lie down in, or forms to climb through. I would go out at night to see the effect of moonlight, and then wait for the rising sun and make notes as to what happened then. In Greece, the inspiration was fantastic. I ran up hills like a hare with my notebook to get there first and have the total impact of solitude. I made many drawings for new sculptures called Delphi, Delos, Mycenae, Epidaurus, and Santorin. These forms were my experience there. After my solitude, I waited for the 199 people I had left behind, and watched their movements and responses on entering the architecture in the superb location of mountain, hill, and plain. This was very antisocial, I admit, but I had waited 30 years to get to Greece. This was a most exciting period. A friend had asked for samples of Nigerian wood to be sent to me. Suddenly, I got a note from the docks to say that 17 tons of wood had arrived at Tilbury docks, and would I please collect. The logs were the biggest and finest I had ever seen. Most beautiful, hard, lovely warm timber. The great logs have set me off on a new phase of work. Already one of the largest logs is taking shape. A great cave is appearing within it, and I have tunnelled right through the 48 inches, and daylight gleams within it. It is terribly exciting to have such enormous breadth and depth. When I have finished, perhaps I shall be able to get inside it. Now I want to carve them all at once. In all these shapes, the translation of what one feels about man and nature must be conveyed by the sculptor in terms of mass, inattention and rhythm, scale in relation to our human size, and the quality of surface which speaks through our hands and eyes. Working in the abstract way seems to release one's personality and sharpen the perceptions, so that in the observation of humanity or landscape, it is the wholeness of the inner intention which moves one so profoundly. The components fall into place, and one is no longer aware of the detail, except as the necessary significance of wholeness and unity. A rhythm of form, which has its roots in earth, but reaches outwards towards the unknown experiences of the future. The thought underlying this form is, for me, the delicate balance the spirit of man maintains between his knowledge and the laws of the universe. All landscape needs a figure, and when a sculptor is the spectator, he is aware that every landscape evokes a special image. In creating this image, the artist tries to find a synthesis of his human experience and the quality of the landscape. The forms and piercings, the weight and poise of the concrete image also becomes evocative, a fusion of experience and myth. I wanted to go free. I'd been experimenting with colour in relation to bronze, and I wanted to go free and hang up a circle. Why shouldn't I? It seems to upset people. I find it very serene and quiet. I had been very ill, and I wanted to do it. It had been boiling in my mind. I admit it's not easy to show. I hated it at the Tate, but in the St. Ives churchyard setting, it looked marvellous. In sculpture, there must be a complete realization of the structure and quality of the stone or wood which is being carved. But I do not think that this alone supplies the life and vitality of sculpture. I believe that the understanding of the material and the meaning of the form being carved must be in perfect equilibrium. There are fundamental shapes, which speak at all times and periods in the language of sculpture. In a way, carving is close to writing music, insofar as the composer takes in his whole work from beginning to end before he writes it down. Once you start, it has its complete logic. It's an inevitable procedure. I love marble, especially because of its radiance in the light, its hardness, precision, and response to the sun. Marble is indeed a noble material. It has a most exceptional sensitivity and delicacy, as well as a tremendous strength. I must always have a clear image of the form of a work before I begin. Otherwise there is no impulse to create. The kind of sculpture that I indulge in is hard work, and I would always hesitate to start doodling with a mass of wood or stone, as if I were waiting for the form to develop out of the work. Still, the preconceived form is always connected with a material. I think of it as stone, or as bronze, or as wood, and then I carry out the project accordingly, imposing my own will on the material. I have to fall in with the material I'm using, but I always know what I want from the beginning. Ideas are with one for a very long time. In Rome, when I was 21, I found a beautiful piece of marble, and I thought, I must make something to go on top. Then we had to leave Rome, and I didn't have enough money to bring back the marble with me. All my life, though, I've wanted to put a form on a form as an offering. I don't think anyone realizes how much the last 10 years has been a fulfillment of my youth. But going back also opens the door to brand new ideas. Looking back, I ask myself why I didn't do more work, but you can't hurry things up. I find it easier now. I'm more free to make forms and move them around. I don't feel so personally involved. It's so natural to work large. It fits one's body. I've always wanted to go to my arm's length and walk round things, or climb up them. I kept on thinking of large works in a landscape. This has always been a dream in my mind. I'm not exactly the sculptor in the landscape anymore. I think of the works as objects which rise out of the land or the sea mysteriously. Any stone standing in the hills here is a figure, but you have to go further than that. What figure? And which countenance? I like to dream of things rising from the ground. It would be marvelous to walk in the woods and suddenly come across such things, or to meet a reclining form. You can't make a sculpture without it being a thing, a creature, a figure, a fetish. That is what sculpture is about. It's something you experience through your senses, but it's also a life-giving, purposeful force. Good things always seem concrete to me. Bad things seem amorphous. Sculpture is to me an affirmative statement of our will to live, whether it be small to rest in the hand, or larger to be embraced, or larger still to force us to move around it and establish our rhythm of life. Sculpture is, in the 20th century, a wide field of experience, with many facets of symbol and material and individual calligraphy. But in all these varied and exciting extensions of our experience, we always come back to the fact that we are human beings of such and such a size, biologically the same as primitive man, and that it is through drawing and observing, or observing and drawing, that we equate our bodies with our landscape. Each different form, each different response is valid as a kind of testimony. My own testimony represents the sum total of my own life and experience in that particular moment as a response to that particular experience. The dominant feeling will always be the love of humanity and nature, and the love of sculpture for itself.